Well, it's great to be with you for Future Church, and I am the privilege, and it's an absolute privilege to be with Luke Mansfield today. And I've known Luke a long time. In fact, I've known him since he was a kid, because he was one of the youth in the church that I served in Portsmouth. And he came to faith through that church and through the ministry, really, of your mates, didn't he? Through,
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely incredible, yeah. And he went on to join London City Mission, and he's been a youth worker, and he's been the minister of 2 Baptist churches, and he's now in Plymouth, a lovely naval town. And at Hope Baptist Church. So it's great to have you here. It is an absolute privilege. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. It's good to see you. Good to see you again after all these years.
Yeah, absolutely. Tell us a little about, just as a sort of introduction, a little bit about your context, a little bit about what you're doing, just to give people a bit of a picture.
So yeah, I'm now pastor of Hope Baptist Church in Plymouth. It's a vibrant inner city church made up of around 200 people, all ages and all generations. We kind of buck the trend a little bit when it comes to church for that, because we are really a church of 0 to 90 with a good age mix of every age in between, which is a beautiful thing, but brings its challenges as well. And like you said, Richard, we know each other from Portsmouth, and particularly the area where our church is based very much reminds me of home, because it's a very big kind of place where there's lots of houses, lots of people around and things. So there's lots of missional opportunities, which is really exciting.
Fantastic. Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I can almost picture it as you speak, because just thinking about Portsmouth, it does give you a feel and a flavour. They are very similar towns, aren't they?
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the reasons why I wanted to get you to talk about Future Church is because you have a wealth of experience. You know, you've dipped your toe into all sorts of different pools over the years. And you're still young enough to, have that vitality and that vibrancy and that thrusting nature, et cetera, et cetera. So when you think about the church as it's got to become, in the next 10 years or so, what are the key things that really strike you?
Yes, I mean, it's a really good question, isn't it? Because like you said, Richard, the church does have to change. If you look at the Baptist Union as it is, I think I read a statistic the other day which said something like, there are 2,000 churches within the Baptist Union, and over half of those have under 40 members within their church, which suggests that unless things change, things are going to die out relatively quickly. So I think if things stay the same, in 10 years' time, you've got to be asking the question, is there even going to be a Baptist church in the way that we know it in this country? But I think you can look at it from another dynamic as well, because you can look at it and say, actually, this presents to us a real missional opportunity, because in some ways the old way of doing things is naturally dying out. So we're at a crossroads where we can say, okay, God, what is it you're calling us to for this season, and how are you wanting us to do it? There are still some obstacles, because we are creatures of habit, aren't we? I think, I looked at the kind of COVID season that we've kind of come out of as a real missional opportunity, because we all went online for a while, and particularly in our kind of context, we were talking about the fact that this is great in the sense that we're going to be reaching people that we never normally would reach by just doing a Sunday service and doing things that we always did. So we were quite dynamic during that time in terms of what we were doing online. But we are creatures of habit, so we've just gone back almost. Now things have settled down and calmed down, it's very easy just to go back to do things that you know about and you always have done. And that's the danger for the church, isn't it, really, I think? Unless we are willing to genuinely pray that prayer, God, what is it you're calling us to do in this next season? We're always going to do things the same. Yeah,
I think, you're so right. I mean, you're so right in terms of we like the status quo. It's comfortable, isn't it, in the status quo? And I think it's true of us all, isn't it? And one of the things I was saying to somebody last week was that it's a monumental struggle personally to make a change. It takes so much effort, because you've got to maintain what you are doing, whilst at the same time making the change that you are wanting to see. And that's something that I think sometimes people are just too exhausted, too tired to be able to try and do. But you're right. I do think we've got no choice. I was talking to one of the regional ministers just last week, and he was saying that in their particular association, in their region, whilst the church has weathered the storm of COVID quite well, having come out the other side, finding that costs have gone through the roof and things like that, over the next 3 years, they're going to see probably about 40% of the churches in their association disappear.
Wow.
That's staggering, isn't it?
It is. It is.
It really is, yeah.
No, it is. But like I said, I think it also presents us with an opportunity, because when I was in my first pastorate in Honiton, I arrived at a church which was pretty much dying at the time. There were, on our first Sunday, 25 people there, and that was including my family of 4 for my first Sunday there.
Okay.
Everyone was over 70. And you know what I was like as a teenager, Richard? I was quite, I had a habit of putting my foot in it a lot of the time. That hasn't really changed. And I remember sitting down with my leaders for the first time and saying, guys, in 3 years, unless we do change, then this church isn't going to exist. And I said, I'll be honest with you, as a family moving into this town, I would not look at this church twice.
Whoa, okay.
And my leaders turned around to me and said, okay then, well, what have we got to do to change? And there was a real heart and a real desire to see what God could do by doing things a little bit differently. And in that context of 25 people where they realised they needed to change, there was an openness to it. I think for me, what I found moving to a bigger church in a bigger context, which looks like it's doing relatively well for itself because we are numerically large, it's much harder to get any kind of change. People are quite happy and quite comfortable where they're at. And because it looks successful, people are quite happy to stay as they are. So with the fact that the church is shrinking, for want of a better word, I genuinely think that presents some real good missional opportunities for us as well.
Okay. So do you think that's one of the first things that is going to be a prerequisite if we're going to become the church that we need to be? That there needs to be a greater openness to the development and change. I mean, one of the things that I find ironic is that, because my context was very similar to the one you're in. It was a church that saw itself as successful.
Yeah.
It was a church that had actually had a good reputation for a number of years. And when I came in, they said, we want change. And then when I arrived, there were those that didn't want change. And it wasn't that they were lying, it's that they didn't realise that the implications of what change actually meant. And so it's taken me sort of 13 and a half, 14 years to get to the point. And COVID helped with that, without a shadow of a doubt. But when you look at that, that need for openness, that need for willingness to try and risk. David, my son, said, isn't it ironic, Dad, that those who are most resistant to change will leave the church because they don't like change and impose the greatest change upon themselves that you can possibly imagine.
Yeah.
And there's an irony in that, isn't there?
There is. And I think it comes down to the fact that actually no one is resistant to change. Everyone changes things all the time. When you go home, you look at your living room one day and you might think, actually, this needs a new coat of paint. So you're quite happy to go and paint your living room because that's a change that you have implemented in your life. People are resistant to change when it's a change which is kind of forced upon them.
Okay.
And I think that's the key, because people don't feel they have that sense of control when it comes to change within the life of the church. When the minister comes in or the leadership team say we're going to do this, and it's not come from them, that's when the resistance to change comes, because they don't want their lifestyle to change because it's been imposed upon them. And I think that's our challenge as leaders and as the church. How do we take people on a journey to see that change is a good thing?
Yes.
God never changes, the gospel never changes, but people do change. So we need to adapt to share that good news with people in a changing world.
Okay, yeah, that's really interesting. Do you know, one of my elders in Portsmouth once said to me, do you know, one of the things I've realised about God's unchanging nature is that he changes everything.
Yeah.
And I found that really helpful.
Yeah.
It's not that God doesn't change, it's God doesn't change in his essential being, but anything he touches changes. Generally it comes back to life, but there you go. So it's really interesting.
Yeah.
So if that's one of the features, if that's one of the things that we're going to have to do, if we're going to get from here to where we need to go, what are the other things that you would say are absolutely vital that we need to consider?
I think for me, and looking at my own story and my own context in terms of how I came to faith, I don't come from a Christian family. I would go as far as saying my parents were atheists. My mum had some sort of nominal belief in God, but my dad was very resistant to God. So my mum sadly passed away when I was 22, and my dad then didn't speak to me for a number of years, because it's very hard to be angry with a God that you don't believe in. So what do you do with that? You be angry with someone who works for the church. So we didn't speak. And the reality is, I think, looking at that kind of context, and looking at the context I'm in now in terms of the church and growth, a lot of our growth in terms of church has been transference growth. It's been other Christians joining us or moving into the church. But actually, we're not necessarily reaching those people who desperately need to hear the news of Jesus. And I remember my first time coming to Tangier Road Baptist Church, actually. And I remember being absolutely freaked out by what I saw. And I went home and I told my mum about it that morning. And she said to me, well, it's obviously a cult. I'd steer well clear of it if I were you. But I didn't. I kept going because there was a curiosity about what faith was and about what it meant to follow Jesus. And as a result, I found Jesus for myself.
Okay.
The reality is, as the church at the moment, we are not geared up for people like me, I don't think.
Right.
Really.
Okay.
And we have to change our mentality to reach the average Joe on the street who has no knowledge of faith, who has no real desire to know about God. And how do we make church relevant so they can explore faith for themselves? And I think for me, that's the absolute key. We have to be willing to change what we do to reach those outside.
Okay. So how do we do that? How do we, if we have to do that, how do we do it?
Well, I think first and foremost, it's about knowing who we're trying to reach, isn't it? I think often the church can be 20 years behind the times in terms of what it's trying to do and what it's trying to achieve. So we need to know the people who are on our streets. We need to know their context. We need to know what makes them tick. We need to know how to communicate with them effectively. Again, I look at my children. I was a youth worker 15 years ago, and I look at where my children are at now and the things that they're doing and the things they're involved in, and it's a totally different world. So we have to be a people who understand the context that we're in first and foremost in order to reach people with the greatest news ever. Yeah,
absolutely. One of the things I say to my church is that love has got to be the foundation. One of the things I did when I first arrived here is I put up a poster at the front of the church, and I only intended it to be there temporarily, and it just said, "Everyone welcome." Well, in the first 6 weeks, that caused really interesting dynamics because if everyone is welcome, then we're going to have to put up with things that we may not feel comfortable about.
Yeah.
And I ended up having to have a conversation with the whole of the congregation and say, listen, everyone welcome doesn't necessarily mean anything goes.
Yeah.
But it does mean that if you don't feel welcome, then nobody's welcome. If they don't feel welcome, then I'm not welcome. And we've had to work at that dynamic because it does mean that you have to make alterations, you have to make changes, and now we're in a situation where we've got people from different nationalities. I think we've got 20 nationalities in the congregation. We've got folks who are struggling with their sexual identity. We've got we've got real people with real problems, and it's presented us with real challenges.
Yeah.
But it's also presented us with tremendous opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. And for me, I look at that and think, well, the church should be a place of mess in that sense, shouldn't it?
Yes, yes.
And if it's not, then we're on a kind of limited time frame because eventually it will die out the way we're currently doing things and what we currently achieve.
Yeah, do you know, I've always said I'd rather be the pastor of the church in Corinth than the church in Galatia.
Yeah.
Because Galatia seemed to think they got it all sussed and all, put in its nice boxes and things like that.
Yep.
And Corinth was a right mess. And I prefer the mess.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because, I mean, to a certain extent, that's true of, when you look at your background, you came out of a mess and you've returned in a way to the mess.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So what else? What else do you think we need to be doing?
Yeah, I think, to be honest, like I said, first and foremost, it's meeting people where they're at, understanding how we can change what we do for people to understand the good news, and then ultimately being willing to do it. And it, in some ways, it means ripping up the rule book, doesn't it? Why does church have to look like everyone sitting in rows on a Sunday listening to a 30-minute sermon, and then going off and going about their daily business? What does church look like apart from a Sunday morning? It's being willing to adapt, I think, everything at our absolute core in order to reach people. And that might mean that actually what we do looks totally different forever, really.
Yeah. So in a way, it's picking up on what Paul says, doesn't it? About we must use all means to save some.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely that. I've got to know a couple of guys recently who my son's dad's at my son's football team, and we go and play golf most weeks together. And I look at these guys and think, you know what? If you were to ever come to my church, right, you would not have a clue what was going on, and you wouldn't. I don't even think they'd be able to engage in faith in the way that we actually do things at the moment. But
sorry, go on.
That's all right. No worries. I don't think they'd be able to engage in faith in the way that we do things at the moment. So it's about bringing things to their level, really, isn't it? I come back to the story of the woman at the well, where Jesus meets the woman at the well. What does he do? He doesn't go in straight away with a deep theological argument. He talks to her about something that she can understand. She's there to collect water, so Jesus talks to her about water. So for me, and coming back to what you were saying about that post that you had at the front of your church, you know, love has to be the foundation. Yeah. And when we start with that and we understand people, I think innovation and creativity then comes out of that. Okay. When we truly know where people are at, we can then innovate, hopefully, to meet them with what they need.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so easy, isn't it? It's so easy to actually make blanket statements about people when you've never met one.
Yeah.
But the minute you meet one, whatever that one may be, suddenly you've got a face, and you've got a face to the actual thing that you're talking about, and it's much harder to make judgmental statements on that basis. Yeah. Because you're now going, well, actually, I've met them, I like them. Yeah. Do I might even love them. Yeah. And I really want them to know the one that I love, and that makes a huge difference.
Definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I know that isn't simple, and I know it actually takes quite a lot of effort, and it can cause quite a lot of unpopularity for those that seek to bring it into a church. But it also sounds quite simple. Is that all it's about, Luke, or is there more? Have we made things too complicated?
I think part of the problem with church, as it is now, is we have become much too program focused and program based. Come to my events, come and join in with this, come and join in with that. And what we end up doing is burning out those people who are already part of our congregations. Okay. So they don't feel like really anything is being achieved. And people are stopping coming because we're in a different day and age. Yes. And as a result of that, what we're doing is not really effective. Okay. But what does it look like just to do things much more simply? Just to break bread with those people that would never come along to church, and just begin to open up conversations about life and about faith in a very different way. And I think the reality is, it's not simple, but it is, isn't it? I think.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, and it's refreshing to hear you actually say it, because we have become slaves to the program. Yeah. And we have, as a consequence, we have lost the desire to have meaningful relationship. Yeah. And I certainly know when I arrived here, your spirituality was judged by the number of things you attended. Not about whether you had an intimate relationship with Jesus. Yeah. Or how many people outside of the church you interacted with and had relationship with. It had nothing to do with any of that at all. No. And that, you're right, that needs to change. Yeah.
And what does it look like for us as a church if we do become much less program driven, but much more focused about equipping people to meet others where they're at, on their front lines, on the school gates, in their workplaces, in the environments where we spend most of our life? How would that affect the church? I think it would only be a positive thing if that was our focus, rather than kind of putting on the show on the Sunday, or making sure all of our programs are keeping on going. What does it look like for us to invest in those people who are already part of our congregations, to equip them to do the mission that God is calling them to do? And I think that should be our focus.
Yeah. Now, I know what somebody's going to say, and so I'm going to say it on their behalf. Yeah. Okay, that's all very well, Luke, but what happens to the things that have to be done? What happens to the managing of the finances? What happens to the buildings? What happens to worship on a Sunday if everybody that's in your worship team decides to buzz off and do stuff out in the world with all these people that they're wanting to engage with? How do we... Go on. What's the answer?
Yeah, and there's not an easy answer, is there? Because we are in this kind of flux where we do have to... There are things that we have to do, and there are things which are good to do. Yeah. But I think we have to be brave at times to be willing to lay some stuff down as well. Of course, there are financial implications that we have to look after and we have to manage well. We have to be good stewards of things that God has given us. We have to make sure all of our safeguarding things are in place and all of this. But sometimes as well, I think as a church, we need to be brave, and we just need to say, if this is what God is calling us to do, the things that don't really matter, we've got to be brave enough to let go of.
Yes, yeah. It was interesting when I was at Tangier Road when you were there that we found that the more we invested in the people and the more we released the people to do what they felt called to do. And we had this multiplicity of projects that went out into the community, extraordinary things that some folks were doing. Yeah. The more they wanted to invest in those who invested in them. And we always found that there were musicians who wanted to be in the worship group because it was an expression of their personality, and it was the contribution that they felt they could legitimately make. And so rather than robbing us of the resource of people, it enriched us with people. And that's been extraordinary. And I was thinking about it last week. Out of that time in the life of the church, there are now 20 people in full-time Christian ministry.
Yeah, amazing.
That came out of that period. Now, that is amazing. And in some ways, I remember we read a book called Beyond Renewal as a leader. It's probably way out of print now. And it was a church in Australia that decided that instead of being program-based and controlling as a leadership, they were going to become permission-giving. Yeah. So they started these conversations with members of the congregation and say, if you could do anything for God and time and money and circumstance were no obstacle, what would you do? And people started to cry, and they shared their story, and they went, right, you can do it. Yeah. We'll give you the resources, we'll help you, we'll support you. And that's what we did at Tangier Road. Right. And it made a huge difference. And in a way, you're the product of that. And it's interesting to see that.
Absolutely, yeah. And, I think one of the big things for us as a church and thinking these things through in terms of what we do and how we can invest into people better is I look at my own time and I think, I spend a day a week probably preparing a sermon, a 30-minute sermon, which, I'm a preacher. I believe in the power of preaching. I believe that God does stuff when we preach and has an impact on those that are listening. But I also understand that I think the average person retains something like 8% of what you say when you preach on a Sunday. So for a whole day of preparation before delivery, for someone to get 8%, and often the 8% they get is not actually what you've said.
It's true. It's true.
What would it look like if we used that time to invest more in people rather than all of that preparation? How could we release people to do what they're called to do? And like you said, I think that was an incredibly fruitful time back at Tangier Roads. And because I look at that, people invested in me. They took the time to invest in me. It wasn't necessarily, you've got to come to this, and this, but there was a genuine investment into my life. I look back on some of my youth workers in that time who really poured into me.
They adopted you, didn't they? Yeah, they became your second family. They adopted you. It wasn't that they actually invested in you like you were some project.
Yeah, that's it.
They loved you.
Yeah, and I think of one in particular who we both know very well, Paul. I'll phone him up, and the first thing he'll say to me on the phone is, "When are you coming to stay?" Because generally that's what I'm phoning up for if I need a bed because I'm down in Portsmouth. But that's how he'll answer the phone to me, and they did become my family.
Yeah.
But,
which is
that was the investment, I think, which made me realise that wow, this is God has a plan for me, and as a result of that,
And the thing, and this is the thing I think is really quite exciting about this conversation is that we're quite good as church at that. We're quite, and I'm talking about pretty much most churches. The ability to adopt strangers and make them friends and part of the family is in our DNA. Yeah. Now, we may have actually lost focus on that because of programs and, busyness and all the other things. But it's not difficult to get back to it where we just love people into the kingdom. Yeah. And that's exciting.
Absolutely. And yes, there's going to be other things that we need to do. And yes, we will, I'm not against programs and things like that. I think there is a time and a place for us to do these sort of things. But what if that wasn't our main priority and people became our main priority?
Yeah, you just went politic on me. You know, you're thinking, oh, crumbs, one of my congregations are going to watch this. And, you know, I better put this in because, but you're right. You're right. I mean, it's never going to be, you know, you don't turn over and there's a blank page. That's not how a church that's been around for a long time is, you know, and even with new churches, you know, you plant a new church and within 4 years you're dealing with the traditions.
Yeah.
You know, it's never going to go away because, as you said so rightly at the top end, you know, people are creatures of habit, and what we need to do is to create a habit where flexibility and change are part of the habit.
Yeah,
and that's really helpful.
And I think you would hope that as a church, as a society, we have become quite good at change over the past 3 or 4 years with the whole COVID thing, which was kind of change forced upon us, like in a drastic way. You kind of hope that some of the good that's come out of that is maybe we can be more flexible as a result of seeing that it's not going to be the end of the world when things have to absolutely flip on their heads. Yeah, I think that's right. You know, I mean, if you'd have told me at the beginning of that year, you know, 2021, that by, you know, in 4 months' time, we would be doing everything off Zoom. Yeah. I didn't even know what Zoom was, never heard of it. And that it would be okay. And actually we as a church, we saw absolute blessing through that period. Extraordinary, really. You know, we came together as a fellowship. We were on the same page, et cetera, et cetera. If you'd have told me that at the beginning of the year, I'd have not believed you. No. Because I thought that's going to take me another 10 years. Yeah. And it's funny because I remember when I came to Hope, one of the first things I did was talk to some of the people involved in the tech sort of side of stuff and say, do you know what? I think it'd be really good if we started live streaming our services. And we bought some equipment to live stream our service. This was before COVID, but it caused uproar. People could not get their head around it. Why would you want to do this? We don't want to be on camera. Within a week, everyone's like, this is brilliant. I'm so glad that we're here. So we can do change. Yeah. But it's how we bring that about in a way which is healthy for the church and helps people go on that journey, isn't it? Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great place to finish, I think, because that's a really great statement. Because you're right, you know, it is something that we are able to do. We just need to do it with all our hearts, don't we? And one of the things I say to my church is, you've not learnt it till you live it. Yeah. And so we are trying to be more dynamic in terms of, you know, taking the truths of Scripture and planting them in our lives in conscious and deliberate ways. And that's really helpful. Yeah, great. Hey, mate, thank you so much. I mean, I'm so glad we managed to do this. We tried once before, didn't we? And it failed miserably. So that's brilliant. And I am so grateful. And, you know, God's richest blessing on you in the future. You know, it sounds as if things are going great. And that's such a joy for me as the old dude to hear and to see. And love to Gemma. And I know your kids don't know me. In fact, I don't think they've ever met me. No, I don't think so. But Gemma I met a few times. And, you know, man, you landed on your feet when you got your missus. Yeah, you really did. She is absolutely brilliant. So, you know, bless you. And thanks ever such a lot. No, it's good to chat. Good to chat.